Hello, I'm Karen Pascal, the Executive Director of the Henri Nouwen Society, and I want to welcome you to a new episode of Henri Nouwen, Now and Then. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to another person who knew Henri Nouwen well while he was alive. My guest is Father John Deere. John Deere is an internationally recognized voice and leader for peace and nonviolence. We were looking forward to having John as our keynote speaker at the third annual Voices for Peace gathering here in Toronto, and then the coronavirus happened and everything ground to a halt. I'm sad that we had to postpone this event, but I am delighted to have the opportunity to talk with John Deere today. John is the co-founder of Campaign Nonviolence and the Nonviolent Cities Project. He's been nominated many times for the Nobel Peace Prize, and he is the author of 35 books. John Deere, please tell me, how are you weathering this huge COVID-19 storm?
Well, thanks for having me, Karen, and I'm fine. I was just going to head out on this big 2-month, 25-city speaking tour. Been working on it for 6 months. You know, every minute lined up, and much of it I was literally driving across the country. I live right on the coast near Big Sur in California now, and I was going to drive to Maine with speeches all along the way. And I got 3 or 4 days into it and had a couple of great events. And then one morning it was so clear to everybody about the pandemic, and everybody canceled it. And so I turned around and drove home. So it's been strange for me because I had this big tour. I was going to go out and be gone for 2 months, and now I'm home. But I'm fine, and been talking to friends and been working away with my peace group, Pace e Bene, and enjoying the coast. I live on this, it's really embarrassing, a stretch of 10-mile beach with nobody else around.
Oh,
Somebody
lucky
found
you.
me a little yeah. Somebody found me a little hermitage on a 1,000-acre ranch, which was owned by a very elderly peace activist, and they fixed it up for me. And now I live here, and I've joined the Diocese of Monterey. So it's paradise, and I'm actually sitting in my car here because the phone reception is better, right on the ocean, looking out over 10 miles in either stretch of the California coast. So don't feel too sorry for me, Karen.
I don't at all. You got to isolate in the perfect place. I'm
Well,
envious.
I've been practicing self-isolation for a long time, so it's kind of normal for me. It's kind of a hermit life anyway, you know. So anyway, I'm fine. And how are you?
I'm doing well, and the Nouwen Society is doing well. But of course, events that we were excited about have all kind of ground to a halt, and we definitely want to be able to speak into the lives of people that are listening to this podcast, you know, where we find our strength and resources in the midst of a world that has changed so dramatically overnight for all of us. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, and I want to start here, clearly the call on your life has been as a peacemaker, as somebody called to this as a follower of Christ. How did this take hold of your life, John?
Well, these are great mysteries. What happened to me? I think about it all the time, and well, you know, it's hard to say in a nutshell. I just turned 60. I was 8 or 9 when Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were killed, and I came from a very politicized family in Washington, D.C. My father was one of the heads of the National Press Club, so I was totally aware of the Vietnam War and Dr. King at age 6, 7, 8. And when they were killed, it changed my life. I know that sounds weird, but maybe I was a weird kid or precocious or something. And I went into a long depression that lasted many years. And then when I was in college at Duke, I studied African American history as a major. But I was going through a spiritual crisis too, and deciding to leave the church. Anyway, that came to a head, and I thought, well, if I really believe in God, I have to give my whole life to God. And I'm always reflecting on Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy, and particularly their deaths. And I thought, well, if they kill the greatest people our country has produced, there's not much you can do. And so I know this is convoluted, but I then decided one day, well, I'm just going to give my whole life to God and to Jesus and become a priest and become a Jesuit. So that's that. That was my plan. And then my parents were quite appalled by this, as were a lot of friends. And my parents asked me to wait. And so I spent a year working for the Kennedys when I was 20 or 21. And I'm pretty close to Mrs. Ethel Kennedy now, and was going to see her next week. That was part of the tour. And Carrie Kennedy, who runs the RFK Human Rights Center, which is I used to work for when I was 20. It's the only job I ever had in my life. And I always joke with Ethel Kennedy that she paid me $50 a week, which was not much. But I thought, if I'm going to give my life to Jesus, I want to go see where he lived. And I announced to my parents I was going to go hitchhiking through Israel for the summer, 1982, before I entered the Jesuits. And what happened was Israel invaded Lebanon. All the Holy Land tours were canceled. I went ahead, a very dopey kid, and hitchhiked through Israel and camped out for several weeks by the Sea of Galilee. There was nobody else there, visiting the Chapel of the Beatitudes, really, really pondering the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and the call, blessed are the peacemakers, and love your enemies. I was really shaken by those words. And as I was pondering those words, I saw all these jets swoop down over the Sea of Galilee and drop bombs a few miles away at the Lebanon border. And I decided then and there that I would spend the rest of my life working for peace and the Sermon on the Mount. And that's what I've been trying to do. And I really came back from that trip a different person. I entered the Jesuits a different person than the one who applied. And within several weeks, I was with Daniel Berrigan. I was getting arrested. Later, I went and lived in the war zone in El Salvador with the Jesuits, who were later killed. And now I've been in and out of jail my whole life now, since 1982. And I, was a kid, and I'm going, well, how do you be a peacemaker? I don't know. So I'm looking at Dan Berrigan and Henri Nouwen and Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King and Gandhi. They all give speeches. They all wrote books, and all of them got arrested. And so that's what I started to do regularly. I wasn't that bright. And in terms of Henry, later I wrote to him about this, and he was a big supporter. But that's what happened to me, and I'm stubborn. I've just stayed with it because I do think that peacemaking is the heart of the gospel of Jesus, and his way of nonviolence is the only thing that works and makes sense, and that the gospel doesn't make sense without reading it from like a Gandhian, Kingian perspective of peace and nonviolence. So I've actually gotten more committed the older I get, the more I understand these great peacemakers and the life of Jesus. And I like this morning, I feel like I've been a total failure at this call that I've had.
But you've been so committed to it.
I'm still at it.
Yeah.
Huh?
You've been so committed to it.
And I think that's pretty normal. You know, it's almost impossible to make peace in this world, and that's why everybody gives up.
Yeah.
But I'm trying not to give up.
Well, how did you and Henry actually meet? You said you wrote to Henry. Well, tell me a little bit about that. How did he impact you, and how did you impact him?
The weekend before I left to live in El Salvador for like 6 months in 1985, I spent a day with Henry, and at the Sojourners Peace Pentecost, which is one of the greatest peace events I've ever been to in my whole life. And there were 1,000 people there and all these great speakers. And Henry was actually, it was in the gym at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And on that Pentecost Sunday morning, May 1985, Henry was on the program to be the main speaker and preacher. He was the keynote that morning. Well, he talked for 3 hours. I never seen the likes of it in my whole life. And it was the best speech I ever heard. And I bought the tape, and I had a little, cassette tape thing, like 4 inches by 5 inches. And the next day, everybody went and got arrested all over D.C., at the Congress, the White House, the State Department. I didn't get arrested because the next day after that, I was flying by myself to El Salvador into the war zone at the height of the war. And it was really scary.
Oh,
and so Henri was incredible. And his talk was about, hey, you all are activists. And he had 3 texts, as his want. And I used to listen to that tape over and over and practically memorized it. I probably listened to it hundreds of times. And by the way, after Henri died, I sent the actual physical cassette tape to the Nouwen Center, the archives. You have my copy.
Oh, how wonderful.
But because you didn't have a copy of that talk. And
Wow.
Anyway, so he said, he thought that the question for peacemakers was not Jesus wasn't saying to peacemakers, what have you done for peace? But do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? The question from John 21. I didn't know what the heck Henri Nouwen was talking about, but it was challenging because he's saying everything you do for peace and justice should come out of your relationship to Jesus. Now, I was a member of the Society of Jesus, and I never heard that or thought that. And I'm Daniel Berrigan's best friend, and Dan lives that, but he didn't talk about it like that, if you see what I mean, no one talked like that. Well, I was sitting there, and I was too scared to go up to Henri. And I noticed nobody went up and talked to Henri. It's like right out of his books, Karen, he was lonely in the center of the crowd.
Oh.
After he spoke, I can see it in my mind right now. He stood like in the middle of the gym, and no one would go up and talk to him, as opposed to being mobbed. Now, the activists are different. Yeah, and I was way too scared, and it was a lot of younger people. There was no way I was going to go up to him after that. And I thought about that a lot, having become a public speaker myself. Well, anyway, a year later, Brother Patrick Hart, maybe a year or 2 years later, Brother Patrick Hart, who's also a friend of mine, he's a Trappist monk at Gethsemane, and he was Thomas Merton's secretary, and he and I became very close, and I used to go to Gethsemane twice a year for over 30 years.
Wow.
Patrick just died last year. He was the editor of a monastic journal, and of course everybody knew Henri, and I had a lot of friends who knew Henri, the people at Orbis Books, my publisher and all. But he wrote me and asked me to review Henri's new book. I'm having a senior moment about Jesus and following Jesus, and it'll come to me at some point. And I wrote back and said yes, and it was a little crossroad book, and I was at a demonstration. It is so crazy. I was at a demonstration in Washington, D.C. with the homeless, shutting down the D.C. City Council, as you do, and I organized the whole thing, and 15 people were getting arrested, and it was in a building, and I stood away and wasn't getting arrested that day because the Jesuit community told me I couldn't get arrested, and the cops came after me into the crowd and handcuffed me.
Wow.
So I'm put in jail, and the Jesuits never believed me. They said, oh, no, you did that on your own. I'm like, no, but they knew who I was. So I'm in jail, and I have Henri's book in my coat pocket. So I had a pencil, and I wrote the review in my copy of the book. Oh. When I got out of jail, which was really great. So I was in jail for about 48 hours, and I mean in a tiny cell that hadn't been cleaned since 1841. It's the D.C. Central Cell Block, one of the scariest places I've ever been. And so I wrote my review of Henri's book in jail. Oh. And I typed it up. I loved the book. And I'm sorry I can't remember it. It's just my age now. I'm very forgetful. And then I thought, well, I'm going to send it to Henry. And I wrote him a long letter about how I saw him at Peace Pentecost, how I got arrested, and I had the book, and Patrick Hart wanted me to review it, and I loved it, and it helped me. It's those three things about letting go of, based on the temptations and of Jesus, and the minister moving into powerlessness. Maybe you'll remember the book.
I will, and I promise our listeners that they'll get this book in our notes for this podcast. Yeah. We'll be sure and have it there, but I'm not going to offer up which one it is because there's obviously almost 40 books, so it's hard to remember which one.
Book. And Henry wrote me right back, like that the day he got my long letter, and sent me 5 autographed books, and I wrote him right back. And he wrote me right back, and we wrote, till the day he died. The day he died, I got a big package in the mail from him. He clearly had mailed it on the way to the airport or something. But several of us got letters. Now, I was with friends who were on the phone with him, and then I was 3 times we were going to meet. He wrote me and said, I'm coming to Berkeley. I'll see you there. Of course, being a young whippersnapper, I didn't go.
Oh. So you had a good letter-writing relationship, but you didn't connect in person?
And I never then connected with him in person.
Wow.
And I remember at that point I was in prison for a plowshares action, facing 20 years in prison. And I did 10 months in a tiny cell the size of a car.
Wow.
And I wrote to Henry the day or two from jail, hey, look, this is what I've done. I want you to understand. He wrote me right back and said, I'm making a commitment to you. And he wrote me every week. Now, I don't know, by that I mean, so from his perspective, he's in Toronto. I'm in the county jail in North Carolina, in a cell with Philip Berrigan. And Henry knew Dan and Phil very well. He felt responsibility toward me because he knew me as a seminarian, and then he almost came to my ordination. That would have been our first meeting, but his schedule was booked. He sent me this. I'll never forget. I was getting in the car with a pile of Jesuits to drive to Baltimore to be ordained a priest, and the UPS truck pulled up, and there was a 5-foot-long box from Toronto. And all the Jesuits said, what the heck is this? What have you done now? And we all opened it up, and it was a 4-foot by 5-foot poster of the Return of the Prodigal Son.
Oh, my goodness.
And it was mailed by Henry himself. He took it to you because it was all his handwriting. And it just said, a gift for your ordination. Oh. And but my point was, then I went and did this action and was in prison. And I think like every Monday morning in Toronto when he got to the office, and I think this was when, Connie, his secretary,
yes,
was still alive. And he just made sure that something was in the mail to me in jail and he did that every Monday. So by that, in the end, I think I have every book that he ever wrote signed to me.
Wow.
Or I have a lot of manuscripts from him.
Yeah.
And short letters or long letters or things, speeches with notes scrawled on it. I don't remember it all. And but he would write, what can I do for you? And I was writing, well, you can come and see me. You're a priest, you can get in to see me. And that would have happened. But I eventually got out, sooner than I expected. And then I remember, which is in the big letters, if you see the big Love Henry book, there's 3 of his letters to me in there. And there's a long letter to me in jail at the very end of the book. And he said, well, what exactly can I do for you? And I wrote back in a handwritten pencil letter, well, we haven't got to meet yet, so why don't you tell me exactly what your life is like? what is it like to be Henri Nouwen? And you'll see in the book the long letter. It
Wow.
was like a 3-page single-spaced letter he wrote to
Yeah.
me. And my mother was a professor of nursing, and after Henry died, I showed her the actual physical letter that I got in jail. And she read it. I remember we were in the kitchen of my parents' house, and she said, well, no wonder he had a heart attack and died. Because if you read that letter, uh, uh, as you read the journal of his last year, you know, how did he live as long as he did?
Yeah. Yeah. He was.
He was so tired, and he was working like a maniac 24/7. Anyway, that's a lot longer answer. Sorry about that, Karen.
Oh, it's so good. I really, really appreciate hearing that. It helps me so much. Now, after Henry died, you did something which I thought was amazing. You have something to do with putting together the Road to Peace, didn't you? Didn't you come to Toronto and work on pulling that together?
Yeah, it was. So yes, I did. I've done 2 books for Henry. One is The Road to Peace, which was all his writings on peace and justice, and the first version of his manuscript on peace. And then about 5 years ago, Robert Ellsberg, and I went back and re-edited that his manuscript on peace and published that as a standalone book. It's called Peacework, which is a great book.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened there was also very interesting. When I say I got a package for him, I didn't know he was dying in Holland. He sent me a note and a copy of Can You Drink the Cup? Remember, one of his last books while he was
Yes.
alive.
Yes.
And so I was running this huge center for the poor in Richmond, Virginia. And I had been corresponding with Henry about it. It's called the Sacred Heart Center for 1,000 African American women and children. And I had 50 staff people, and I had to raise $2 million a year to run it. I don't know how I did it, and I was writing him letters like, help. How do you be a contemplative in the midst of this? Well, his book, I stayed up all night reading his book, and I loved it so much, and he had a long note scrawled in the book. So I sat down and wrote him a long letter saying, I'm coming to Toronto to see you. And I gave him 3 weekend dates over the next 4 months that I was free. And I just said, that's enough is enough. And then I got a lot of phone calls that Henry had died from his friends. And we decided to drive to Toronto from D.C. to go to the funeral. And when I got there, we spent a couple of days there. Kathy Christie showed me my letter to Henry unopened on his desk.
Oh.
Of course, he never got it.
Wow.
So I was shaken by that. And then they asked me to be one of the people to do the prayers of the faithful with Fred Rogers and others. So I met all of Henry's friends and family very quickly, and I was very moved by the funeral. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life to be at that funeral. The amount of love and humor, sense of resurrection was all amazing.
Wow.
And he became more of a real person to me than the famous person I was writing letters to. So what happened too is Art Laffin and I, this is more again than you want to know, but nobody ever asked me about Henry. We had a car, and you may remember the funeral was at the big Church of the Transfiguration, way out in the boondocks in Markham, outside of Toronto. And then Henry is buried even farther away, a little tiny country cemetery. And for some reason, I mean, there was going to be a funeral procession, but I don't like those, and I didn't like the wait in the car and all that. I said to Art, let's go and get there early. Not everybody was going to the actual burial. So Art and I drove way out in the country to the burial of Henry, which, again, I think only maybe 100 people were invited. I was invited to that. And it was very peculiar. We couldn't find it, and we'd get there, and we're looking around, and there's nobody there in this little church cemetery. except this big empty hole.
Oh.
Now, I know this sounds corny, but I'm standing over it and I'm going, hey, Art, this is an empty tomb. And the way my mind works, I'm going, oh, Henry's risen.
Amen.
And I was overwhelmed.
Oh.
And I suddenly felt, now this is very confessional. I was pretty mean to Henry in some of my letters to him. And I've said this publicly. You may have heard me, Karen. I'm a young activist in and out of jail. And I know he's written a manuscript on peace. And he's never published it. And I write him young activist nasty letters as a Jesuit. Why aren't you doing more for peace? That's exactly what he said in 1985, was not the question. And I think I'm sure I must have hurt his feelings. And I only hit me that moment at the grave. I was kind of overwhelmed with consolation. How nice he was to me.
Oh.
Especially when I was in jail. Now, I can tell you, a lot of activists wrote me off, and relatives and friends did not write to me.
Wow.
When Henry's writing to me once a week, he's the last person I thought would do that.
Yeah.
And that's why he really is Henri Nouwen. I've learned a lot from that guy. I mean, talk about pastoral ministry to me as an ex-con in jail.
Wow.
And I wasn't so nice to him. So there I am, and I thought, it wasn't guilt, but it was suddenly, oh my God. It was the day of his funeral that that was the first time I realized how nice Henry had been to me for 10 years. And regularly and faithfully. And I thought, oh, I owe him. I got to do something. So I called, well, actually, at the funeral, I think we went back to L'Arche, and I started asking around about the archives. And Kathy said, yeah, they're all in Yale, and nobody has ever looked at them. And I said, can I? She said, yes. So I took a week off from my work about 3 weeks later and drove to Yale and spent 2 or 3 days. And I was the first person really to go through Henry's papers.
Wow.
That's what Kathy Christie later told me. And I found all this stuff, Karen.
Oh.
That's where I was the first person to find. It was clearly written in Dutch. His journal from attending the March on Selma, and he heard Martin Luther King speak, and he had never talked about that. And I'm yelling at him, what have you done for peace?
Oh.
And then I find he was a keynote speaker at all these demonstrations. He had been to the Nevada test site before me, and I was on the board of the Nevada test site for 10 years, which is a big protest movement in Nevada where they test nuclear weapons. And one of his letters to me, so I went back and studied his letters after the funeral, and he's writing to me on the day the Persian Gulf War started, January 15th, 1990. I'm getting arrested and organizing the movement, but he spoke to several thousand people in front of the White House that night, organized by Jim Wallace. That never sunk in with me. I'm telling him, what are you doing for peace? And he's calmly telling me, a young activist, whippersnapper, yeah, John, this peace work is really hard. I spoke to the crowd last night in D.C., and they don't want to hear it. Well, the crowd was 2,000 people. That was amazing. So I found all this stuff he'd done, and I think The Road to Peace is a great book, and I wish everyone would get it and go back and reread it. There's a lot of gold there.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the history of this. It means so much to us because, yes, I would encourage people to read that book and encourage them to read Peace Work. I think it's terrific, but I love hearing this history because I know that Henry, the tension for him was, he was definitely had an activist heart and a passion for justice and for rights and for peace. I wondered often if he was held back by the reality that he was a foreigner. He didn't have U.S. citizenship, and whether he worried about if he got arrested, whether they would kick him out. Who knows?
Yeah. I either wrote to him about that at some point, or he I'm sure he wrote to me because I knew that while he was alive. You know,
Yeah.
I'm in jail, and he definitely wrote and said, I thought about doing that, but of course I'm not a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
And I would have probably written him some nasty thing like, "Well, you should do it anyway." And later, as I became friends with all his friends, I mean, really became close friends with some of his friends. They told me, like Carrie, who was living with Henry at L'Arche, she used to talk with Henry about me a lot. And Henry had that comment, well, I could never do what John is doing because I can't get arrested, which now, of course, I totally agree with. But on the other hand, what I'm trying to report is he did an awful lot, but he really was passionate about justice and passionate about the poor and peace. So, for example, he was close to hardcore activists, me, Dean Hammer, and Art Laffin. He did not have to do that.
Yeah.
And he helped Art and Dean a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And he was kind of mentoring us, or just ministering to us, being kind to us, because he could clearly see we were angry young men, angry about nuclear weapons and all. And he was too, but he could help us, and he really helped me a lot, which is why I worked so hard on that book.
Yeah.
The introduction to that book is all my thoughts on Henry, because I spent a year reflecting on the whole thing, and that was up to then. That was the best piece of writing I ever did. And there's a lot. What I learned from Henry is all lined up in that introduction to The Road to Peace, which still stands today, and I hope people get it. But yeah, he was great, and he was doing so much. He was just trying to help everybody, I think, including peace and justice activists.
Well,
and how wonderful!
It's wonderful to hear this. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, he wrote me a letter. So Carolyn Whitney Brown told me that at the morning masses at L'Arche, in the homily, while I'm in jail, he would read my letters, handwritten letters from jail for the homily.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, and the community didn't like it.
Oh, interesting.
That's more normal to me.
Yeah.
Why do you want? And they said to him, "Why are you bothering with us with that guy, that crazy activist who hammered on nuclear weapons?" And Carolyn told me afterwards, and it's in my introduction, that Henry said to the community, "This guy is so passionate about peace and getting rid of war and nuclear weapons. We have to be as passionate about that too. And what we're doing here at L'Arche is the same passion for peace, but we have to articulate it to ourselves the way this guy's articulated it." And that he silenced them. And Carolyn thought, "Hey, this is fabulous." She had met me and heard me speak at the Sojourners' 20th anniversary, and she came back and gave Henry a tape of my talk. So I heard Henry speak at Sojourners, and Henry went and then listened to my tape of my hour-long talk from Sojourners, and he came to Carolyn. This is a side, but the thing that he was most interested, he said, "How come John Deere gets to go and speak at Sojourners and they didn't invite me again?" Which I thought was pretty funny.
His feelings could get hurt. There's no two ways about that. But you know something?
But Henry wrote to me that my work at L'Arche and your work for peace is one work for peace. And that was mysterious to me and helpful. Isn't that great?
Oh, that's lovely. That is so lovely to hear. And you are giving us such a rich insight into Henry from knowing him from a different position than many people know him. I really appreciate that. And I'm really going to encourage people to get those two books and read them. But there's a book right in front of me that I also want to promote, and it is called Praise Be Peace, and it's by you, John. It was the book you were setting out to do this 25-stop tour across North America on. Tell us a little bit about this book. I think I love it, and it's really a book that praises Praise Be to Peace. Why did you write this one?
Well, actually, a couple years ago, the publisher asked me to write it, and I thought, they said, "We want you to write another book." This is a small press called 23rd Publications, and on something about the scriptures. And I had written a little bit about the Psalms. And like everybody, I've read the Psalms and scriptures my whole life. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I waited till I moved here to California. I had a big transition after 20 years in New Mexico. You heard me say I live up here in Big Sur. And here there's a monastery here, the Camaldi Hermitage Monastery. It's the Camaldolese, which is a very strict monastic community, Catholic community, but each monk has their own hermitage around the church. It's very interesting. Merton loved them.
Mm-hmm.
So I went, how do you write about the Psalms? I hate the Psalms, like half of them. I shouldn't say that, but a lot of them are for violence and war. And my whole life is teaching peace and nonviolence. Well, if you look carefully, about 40 or 50 of the 150 Psalms are totally anti-war, and they're all in praise of God for the wonders of creation. My last book was about war and climate change and nonviolence. It's called They Will Inherit the Earth, Peace and Nonviolence in a Time of War and Climate Change. And I was basing it on the third beatitude, where Jesus says, blessed are the meek, which is all about nonviolence, and he connects nonviolence with they will inherit the earth with creation. So if you see nonviolence in Jesus' mind, if you live a nonviolent life, you're one with the earth. Well, we're totally violent, so we're disconnected with the earth, and here we have climate change. It all makes sense. Jesus was a genius, among other things. Well, he got those lines from the Psalms.
You described Jesus as being meticulously nonviolent. I thought that was an interesting phrase for you to say.
Nonviolent. Very, very nonviolent. And his text was the Psalms. And I'm telling you, 40 or 50 of the songs are radical anti-war psalms and in celebration of creation. And that's where you get the word meekness is the only time it's used in the Bible is in the Psalms of peace. And the Psalms about creation. The meek will inherit the earth. That's a line in one of the Psalms. So I was up at the monastery, and it all came to me one day about a year and a half ago. And I just outlined these 40 or 50 Psalms that are totally anti-war and pro-peace. And I wrote little meditations on them. And in the translations, I don't use the word God or him. I keep saying the God of peace. So, for example, I just want to look it up here for 1 second. Psalm 46 has the line, come and see the works of the God of peace who has done awesome deeds on earth, who stops wars to the ends of the earth, who breaks the war bow, who splinters the war spear, and burns the war shields with fire, who then says, be still and know that I am the God of peace. Have you ever in your life, Karen, heard anyone talk about that line?
No, but
God is ending all the wars and burning all the weapons of wars. I never heard anybody talk about that in my life.
No, I found it so powerful. I found that this little book is a treasure. I really have enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And you've caused me to see God in a fresh light. I mean, the fact that every time you refer to God, it's the God of peace. Really, it forced me to go back to the scriptures and say, does it always say the God of peace? It doesn't, but that's how you have brought him through in this book.
Huh?
You've introduced me to the God of peace in a fresh way, in a deep way.
It all goes back to my experience in Galilee in 1982, because I spent months on that line. Blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called the sons and daughters of God. Well, that means you're sons and daughters of God because God is a peacemaker, which means God is the God of peace. Pope Francis has been using this phrase. And, we're working to get Pope Francis to write an encyclical on peace and nonviolence. I think it's going to happen. But this is not a new phrase, but we need to say that and help unpack these great texts that say if you worship God, you are working to end war and you're practicing nonviolence and you're one with creation. And therefore, so the book is called Praise Be Peace, Psalms of Peace and Nonviolence in a Time of War and Climate Change. And my idea was that these teachings and Psalms can help us go forward to live in solidarity with the earth and work to end climate change. By the way, it also works when you're under pandemic. These
It
Psalms, this
does.
is a
It
good
does.
spiritual reading in this
Yeah.
time.
In
So
fact,
I
I,
hope people
I
would get the book. Love.
I pulled something out this morning which I thought was just beautiful. I'm just going to read it for our audience because I felt like this really captures how valuable this text is in the very things that we're going through right now. And you write, even if all hell is breaking loose around us, God will protect those who take refuge in God. Here, for example, is Psalm 3. And here's Psalm 3, the portion you choose. God of peace, you are a shield around me, my glory. You keep my head high. Whenever I cried out to the Lord, I was answered from the holy mountain. Whenever I lay down and slept, the Lord sustained me to rise again. I am not afraid of 10,000 people arrayed against me on every side. Safety comes from the God of peace. And you go on in Psalm 4, we hear the same. Answer me when I call my saving God. In my troubles you cleared away. Show me favor, hear my prayer. You have given my heart more joy than they who have when grain and wine abound. I shall lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, God, God of peace, make me secure. If we take refuge in God and call upon God for help and trust in God, God will protect us, answer our call, be with us, and give us peace. I think this book is a treasure, and you have a big vision for calling us all to be peacemakers. But I also felt like it has a voice of peace to the very hour we're living through right now. Clearly, people are deeply traumatized by what's going on around them. The world has changed overnight. And I just love to kind of hear from you again about, in a sense, you bringing a word of peace to us in the circumstances we're all living in and sharing in around the world.
Well, thank you so much. Well, everything is an invitation to prayer, and Henry would say that. So this time, when the rug has been pulled out from all of our lives, in fact, the whole world, none of us have ever been through anything like this, and it's just overwhelming. And meanwhile, the violence and poverty continues, and so many people could die. Well, it's an invitation to turn back to God and to use, if you're under lockdown, to spend more time intentionally with the God of peace in prayer and meditation. Certainly, I invite everybody to take a half hour or an hour alone with Jesus every day during the lockdown, and then try to make that the regular path for the rest of their lives. And go back to the scriptures to deepen your faith in God. I also use this time to deepen your nonviolence, to be more nonviolent to yourself and nonviolent toward others, and be really attentive and mindful about being nonviolent, because we have to care for one another. And just to be praying for the whole human race. And it's a prayer of repentance, that we would turn away from the culture of violence and the destruction of the earth, and not having health care for others and so forth, that the whole world would wake up and welcome Jesus' kingdom of justice and peace. So, but ultimately, for me personally, and I think for us, Karen, it's an invitation to prayer, to go and be with God and ask God to help us individually in the whole world, maybe as never before in our lives, because I think the world will never be the same. And the hope is, and what we're talking about in the movement, is that this has to become an opportunity to wake people up and change for the better. 9/11 was an opportunity, and we didn't use it. It was used as a trigger event to lead to the deaths of another million people in Iraq and Afghanistan. That could happen with this too. We all need to wake up in prayer, but also prepare to redouble our efforts in the movement to work for a new world of justice and peace, because the empire is going to use it to bring further death and destruction unless we're all more involved than ever. So those are some of my thoughts.
Oh, that is rich, and it's a particularly meaningful. I'm going to want this to go out really this Easter weekend, to be honest with you, because I think as we are, in a sense, held back from our usual rituals for Easter and for this time of year, it's a wonderful opportunity to deepen, to in a sense, like you were alone at the side of an empty grave. We are alone at the side of an empty grave, and really asking the Prince of Peace, the God of Peace, to become profoundly and deeply centering us and leading us into the world that we are responsible for and the world that we're going back into. Things may return not necessarily to what we call normal, but they will go on from this place. We're going to be standing on the trauma of this and the impact of it for years to come, and in the midst of it, the call to be peacemakers.
It's very strange that it's about where we're entering the Easter season, and resurrection means peace and nonviolence, means having nothing to do with death, and it's a good time. I mean, what happened in Easter is Jesus came and said, "Peace be with you, peace be with you." That's his Easter gift to us, and what we want to do as Easter people in this time is really welcome his resurrection gift of peace. And that means we are really going to become peacemakers, peaceful people like Jesus, nonviolent like Jesus, and use this time wisely to become then public peacemakers when the time is lifted. But so as you say, I urge people to go and be with the risen Jesus and really receive his gift of peace, which is wonderful. It's a blessing, and there's hope there.
Oh, John, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this. This is rich. You've given our listeners something special. I thank you so much for being with us. And I'll make sure that links to your book, links to the Take the Pledge. There's all sorts of rich things here. The Campaign for Nonviolence National Conference, which I think probably is up in the air, I'm sure, because who knows when we will be able to gather again.
Hey, that Henri book, Karen, I remember it's called In the Name of Jesus.
Oh, yes.
That's the one that I wrote the review of in jail. Yeah, but I'd love people to check out our group, campaignonviolence.org, and my website is johndeere.org. People want to follow up.
I promise you all those details will be in the web notes. Thank you so much, John. This was a delight for me. Okay. I really enjoyed your company in this. Thank you.
God bless you.
God bless. If you did enjoy this podcast with John Deere, we would be so grateful if you'd take time to give it a stellar review or thumbs up, or even share it with your friends and family. As well, you'll find links in the show notes for our website and any content, resources, or books discussed in this interview. Thank you again for listening. Until next time.